Welcome to GPS, God's Prophetic Surprises, the program where we take an intergenerational approach to the book of Revelation. I'm Jon Paulien, professor of religion at Loma Linda University, and on my left is...
I'm Guilherme Borda, and I am a PhD student in the New Testament at Andrews University.
And joining us from Kansas by Zoom is...
Hey, I'm Nick Snell, and I'm the Youth and Young Adult Director for the Kansas-Nebraska Conference.
So what is a youth and young adult? What's the age spectrum there?
I would say, so I'm in charge of the Adventure Club. So that's like before Pathfinder. It's like almost like Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts that the church has. Mm-hmm. And so that goes down pretty young to probably 5 years old. And then Pathfinders traditionally goes up into about 10th grade. And but young adults, I think we can make it stretch as far as 35 years old or so.
All right, so that's a pretty big group. Now, is there someone else watching out for the little kids?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, we have a children's ministry director.
You have kind of a division of labor there. That's good, because I don't know how you would do toddlers and teenagers in the same program.
Right, I think it's because Adventurers is kind of under the same club ministries like Pathfinders, so they've grouped those together. But thankfully, there's someone else in the office helping with the little ones.
I remember one time I was overseas and they wanted me to do a week of prayer for a high school group there, and they wanted it to be on sex, which is challenging with teenagers. But when I got there, the academy was all the way down to first grade, and now I said, "What are we going to do here?" So anyway, that was a fascinating piece. But let's move on. We're studying the book of Revelation, and we are in chapter 16, the 7 last plagues. And the 6th plague is found in Revelation 16, verse 12. And it says there, the 6th angel poured out his bowl on the great river Euphrates, and its waters were dried up in order that he might prepare the way for the kings from the rising of the sun. Now, if you look at various translations, and I hope you have your Bible handy, if you look at various translations, some of them will say kings of the east, others of them will say kings from the rising of the sun. And so that raises the whole question, how did the ancient Israelites reckon directions? How did the Greeks reckon directions? Either of you have a thought on that? Or are you going to let me? I can see by the look on your face.
You can go.
I'll go with this. All right. It's not a big deal. It's not all that difficult. But both the Greeks and the Hebrews basically did their directions looking to the east. All right. So, for example, for the Hebrews, east was front and west was back. So you see, like you're standing, you're looking to the east. East is front. West is back. South would be what? Right hand, and north would be left hand. All right, so it's just very, very visual kind of a thing. Interesting enough, the Greeks do something similar. East, what do you think? It's sunrise. West is sunset. And then north is top. And south is bottom. All right, so you have top, bottom, sunrise, sunset. So, for the Greeks, sunrise and east are the same thing. And the name for Turkey in Greek is Anatolia, which is from sunrise. Anatole is sunrise. So, in this passage, 16:12, you have kings from the sunrise, kings from the east. Now, in our previous session, we looked at the Euphrates River, and we noticed that in chapter 17, it defines the Euphrates River as the political powers of the world. But then we also looked at the Old Testament, and in the Old Testament, the drying up of the river Euphrates, the Euphrates was the power base of Babylon. So when the Euphrates dries up, it was a symbol of Babylon losing its strength, losing its power, and becoming vulnerable. So we know what the Euphrates River means in Revelation. We now have a sense of what the drying up means, but who are these kings from the east? Anything either of you want to recall from our previous session that we ought to review again before we move forward?
Yes, we talked about, in that session, we talked about how Cyrus came from the east and conquered Babylon. And there was the drying of the river Euphrates, and then they were able to go inside the city of Babylon, conquer it, and it was led by Cyrus coming from the east.
Okay, that's good. So the Cyrus angle, already in the story, kings come from the east, Persia, and comes from the east, dries up the river, conquers Babylon, delivers God's people, and rebuilds Jerusalem. So that's the core story that you'll see also in the book of Revelation. You have an end-time Cyrus, Jesus. You have an end-time river Euphrates, the political powers of the world. End-time Babylon, the religious powers of the world. We'll get into that more later on. You have end-time Israel being delivered and building a new Jerusalem. So that's a backstory for the whole last part of the book of Revelation. Nick, you had a point.
Oh, it was just that Cyrus was also called the Anointed One, as Jesus was also called that.
Yeah, and that's kind of significant, which is why seeing Jesus in the kings from the east here might not be a difficult thing, because in the backstory, Cyrus was named as the Messiah. Yeah. All right. Good points. So, what does east mean in the New Testament is the big question. Rising of the sun, looking to the east. Anybody remember, how was the sanctuary pointed? Either of you remember?
Well, you would come in facing west, right?
All
the
right.
door is facing east.
The door is
So as you
east.
come in, you have your back to east and you're facing west, right?
So when you come in, you're moving away from the east and toward the west. Okay? So what would east represent then? When Jesus comes, doesn't it say, like lightning from the east?
East.
Even goes to the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. So east is often the place from which God comes in the Old Testament and other places. And let's take a look at an example or two. Guillermo, would you read Luke chapter 1? I think it's verse 68, but let me...
It's 78.
78, is it? Okay, glad you're tracking on that reference.
Luke 1, verse
78 is a point of interest here.
Okay, and today I'm reading from the New King James Version, and it says, "Through the tender mercy of our God, with which the day spring from on high has visited us."
All right, so day spring from on high is the Greek word for rising of the sun. So Zechariah here is talking about God sending Jesus, sending the Messiah, and he calls him Anatole. He calls him the sunrise. And then in Matthew 24, as it shines from the east even to the west, the second coming of Jesus comes from the east. Here it's kings coming from the east. So in the New Testament, east can mean east, or it can mean Jesus Christ. Those are the two main meanings in the New Testament. So notice what we did. We found the meaning of Euphrates in chapter 17. In the context, Euphrates River represents the political powers of the world. We found the drying up in the Old Testament is that backstory with Cyrus. And now we find kings of the East would appear to be Jesus. But why is it plural? No? Okay. Did Cyrus come alone?
No.
No, he did not. He came with Darius, among others, perhaps. So Cyrus was not alone. So in the original story, it was plural. But what about Revelation? Who's coming with Jesus? Because it doesn't say king from the east. It could, and still connect to Cyrus. But it says kings of the east. Who's coming with Jesus? I'd suggest that is defined in chapter 17, verse 14. Nick, if you would read that for us.
Yep. They will wage war against the Lamb, but the Lamb will triumph over them because he is the Lord of lords and King of kings, and with him will be his called, chosen, and faithful followers.
So who are these kings? He says he's King of kings. Who are these kings?
Apparently his called and faithful followers.
Yeah, and in the very first chapter of the book, it says, I've made you a kingdom and priests unto God. And that occurs twice earlier on. So we're kings and priests. Obviously, it's imagery, but he has elevated us to royal and ecclesiastical power and privilege. So the kings of the east apparently include the people of God. So now the image is getting. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and one of my favorite parts of Revelation 3, it says, to the one who is victorious, I will give the right to sit with me on my throne.
Oh, good connection. Yeah. All right. So you see then that this east and the kingship and so on, all that is kind of tied together. Just to show that you can't be super organized with Revelation. There's a lot of evocative things here. In the Old Testament, the kings with Cyrus are other pagan kings. Here it's the people of God, but they're also the ones being rescued when Jesus comes. So just like the high priest, it represents Jesus, but is Jesus the lamb? Is he the priest? He's both the priest and the victim. It's kind of like, my head's starting to split, So when we come to Hebrew imagery, we can't always be super logical because sometimes it's poetic and it's capturing images to inspire us. Yeah.
Although one thing that you could say too that makes it not so, that makes it also distinct is that the people of God there might be a rescue of the people of God, but they're not inside Babylon, right? At least at the end. There's those that God says, come out of her, my people, but they'll come out before the destruction of Babylon, right? So
that doesn't quite fit the story, the backstory either.
Yeah.
But I like the point you're making that in the symbolism, Israel's already left Babylon, therefore conquering Babylon.
They don't have to be in there and coming in at the same time because they're not in there anymore.
But what does that mean that we're part of this conquering army? What is the New Testament trying to tell us about that? Any ideas?
Well, we have the notion that we are in a spiritual battle against spiritual forces. In the New Testament, you have that notion. And then in the book of Revelation, you have also the promises to the overcomer. So we have to conquer, to overcome. And the key way that it is shown to us by which we overcome, there's different dimensions to that. Very beautiful, but it's not the topic for today. But the key way is self-sacrificial faithfulness to God, right? And so you have the lamb, the lion of the tribe of Judah conquered as the lamb who died. That's the key way, self-sacrificial faithfulness to God.
All right, so in the New Testament, often military imagery has a spiritual impact. All right, so Chapter 16, verse 12, then kind of yielded itself that it provides the backstory for everything that's happening here. But now, Guilherme, I'll give you a bigger challenge here to read verses 12 through 16. And Nick, I want you to be thinking about this as we're working through that. Verse 12, drying up of the river Euphrates, does what follows, is that chronological? Is it before or is it after verse 12? Right, verse 12 kind of summarizes the plague, but what comes after is a little different. So let's read it and ponder that for a bit.
Okay. Revelation 16, verses 12 to 16. Then the sixth angel poured out his bowl on the great river Euphrates, and its water was dried up, so that the way of the kings from the east might be prepared. And I saw 3 unclean spirits like frogs coming out of the mouth of the dragon, out of the mouth of the beast, and out of the mouth of the false prophet. For they are spirits of demons performing signs which go out to the kings of the earth and of the whole world to gather them to the battle of that great day of God Almighty. Behold, I am coming as a thief. Blessed is he who watches and keeps his garments, lest he walk naked and they see his shame. And they gathered them together to the place called in Hebrew Armageddon.
All right, so 16:12 kind of summarizes the plague, the drying up of the river. You know, you have Babylon exposed in the 5th plague. In the 6th plague, Euphrates River dries up. In the 7th plague, Babylon falls. So there's a logic to the sequence. But what does this other stuff have to do here? These frogs, the gathering of the nations, Armageddon, is that before verse 12 or after it? Do you have any thought on that? Anything jump out at you, Nick?
Well, it can be kind of tricky just looking at our Bibles in English, and it's laid out like verse 12 is a new paragraph in my Bible, and in verse 13 it says then, which is a chronological word, but I heard in Guilherme's translation that it was and. And then there's also the point that the 6th angel poured out his bowl in verse 12, and then just there in 17 you have the 7th. So it seems like it's moving from one thing to the other. But if we're correct that the river Euphrates is in chapter 17, the waters that the great prostitute is sitting on, then they must not be dried up yet. I know Revelation isn't always chronological, and this isn't a part that I've studied out that way a whole lot, but I'm curious to hear what Guilherme and you have to say.
Yeah, I think that's a powerful point, that if the waters are dried up, they're still there in verse 1 of chapter 17. They're still there in 15. The waters you saw are people's nations and stuff. But then in verse 16, the nations change their minds. The nations come to hate prostitute Babylon, and they destroy her. So the drying up of the river seems to be the changing of mind of these nations. And they've been supporting Babylon, and now they aren't anymore. When you go to verses 13 through 15, it shows the gathering of the nations, whereas 17:16 shows the separation. So anyway, what do you think, Guilherme?
So I tentatively would say that 12 to 16 is roughly chronological. The reason I say this is you have this 6th bowl is poured out, this bowl full of the wrath of God. The wrath of God is poured out on the great river Euphrates, and the result is its water was dried up so that the way of the kings from the east might be prepared. This speaks, hey, it's a message of judgment and doom upon Babylon. The end is about to come, right? Because it's dried up. Now, Then you have these 3 unclean spirits like frogs coming out of the mouth of this evil trio, right? The dragon, the beast, and the false prophet. When you consider the parallels, I mean, there's different, points here in chapter 16 that make us think of Exodus and the plagues over Egypt, right? The plagues and the theme of, overall, the theme of deliverance throughout Revelation, and then different aspects of the frogs. And when you go to the second plague over Egypt, the plague where there were frogs, it's very interesting that you have the frogs, the plague takes place, the frogs coming out and then coming to the land and then really disturbing the Egyptians. Then the next thing it says is that the magicians, these are the same magicians, or the Egyptian magicians you have in the first plague as well. They do a counterfeit. They do, the water was turned into blood. We can do that too. Now in the second plague, you have the magicians also do a similar thing with the frogs. They also cause frogs to come up. So they have this move of a spiritual deception that seems to prop the system up and to diminish the impact of the plague. It's like, that's not as a big of a deal. We can do that too.
I really like your point, and I think the point that Guilherme is making is that in the backstory, the frogs were a reaction to the plague.
Yes.
So if we can import that back into the story here, we might think that these are chronological. So I think we want to keep exploring that. I personally feel that 13, 14, and 15 are necessary backdrop to verse 12. It's not our way of writing stuff where we would say verse 12 comes before 13, 14, and 15 with good reason. But it seems to me in the larger picture that comes before, but perhaps we're not yet at the place where we can make a full determination. So let's keep that in the back of our mind. Is verses 13 to 15 prior to verse 12, or is it after verse 12? I think those are things we want to keep in the back of our minds. So you have in verses 13 and 14, you have the dragon, the beast, and the false prophet. And it says that out of their mouths comes 3 unclean spirits that look like frogs. All right? And then it goes on to say that the purpose of these frogs are to gather the nations. So there's a gathering there. What do you do with verse 15? Nick, have you noticed that verse 15 seems to be totally out of kilter? I mean, R.H. Charles, a well-known interpreter of Revelation, said, whoever added 15 here was a stupid editor. What do you think, Nick? Is this the work of a stupid editor? Or what's 15 doing in the middle of all this?
I can tend to be someone that can be on, a certain track, and then it's like, oh, don't forget this. This is really important. And I don't know if it's a stupid editor. I don't think it's an afterthought or anything like that. But as all these things are happening with the beast and the spirits and all of these things, it's like these things may be well underway. It may seem like the devil and his team are kind of having their way. But remember, I come as a thief. Blessed is the one who stays awake and remains clothed, so as not to go naked and be shamefully exposed. So it's going to just seem like the devil's having his way, but never forget that Jesus is coming soon. And, it is just a couple verses later where the 7th angel pours out their bowl in the air, and I think that connects with Jesus coming. So, I think it is just preparation for what's about to happen.
I like the way you framed that. That's really interesting to me, because I know when you're preaching, so often you're in the middle of something. I forgot to say something. Do I bring it in now or don't I? And sometimes it can be a little disjointed, but you want to get the point in. So I think when you look at the larger picture, we haven't done a lot of that yet. When you look at the larger picture, the ultimate battle here is not between, Iraq and Iran. It's not between the U.S. and Russia or Russia and Ukraine. The bottom line here is this is a battle between good and evil. Mm-hmm. It's a battle over the character of God and a battle over the character of those who would follow God and Satan. And so in that context, this is a spiritual battle where God's people are coming together in the shield of God. On the other side are those who are worshiping the image of the beast.
There's a beautiful message here. This notion of keeping the garments reminds me of that parable of the wedding ceremony, where the person that doesn't have the garments, the wedding garments is removed. Very interesting. In verse 12, we have the notion of the way being prepared for the kings from the east. When you look at the book of Revelation, at the word, this word here behind that translation here, might be prepared. You have then later the notion of the marriage or the wedding ceremony of the Lamb. You remember that. The question is, are we preparing ourselves as the bride of the Lamb? While the kings from the east are being prepared, are we individually preparing ourselves as the bride of Christ? Do we have the garments? Mm-hmm. Are we going to be on his side? Or are we so concerned about Babylon and we think that they are going to win the day and we even forgot to be prepared? Mm-hmm.
I think that's an excellent point that you're bringing out. This brings in a spiritual undertone that might be surprising when you see, you've got demons and you got these powers and you got the kings of the world. To a reminder, the purpose of this book is a spiritual one to bring us to the place we need to be at the end. There is a lot of very interesting stuff in verses 13 to 15, and we'll be getting into that as we move forward into this program. So what you see here is two gatherings. You have the three frogs gathering the kings of the world. You have this call of God to faithfulness, and these two groups will be there. Battle of Armageddon. We'll be getting into it real soon. So for all of you, see you again next time. This has been GPS.